Shalom, I'm Yeremia, and today I wanted to discuss the Hebrew versions of Matthew and Luke that some people are out there promoting as having support for the name Jehovah. Some people then are claiming the discoveries of these Gospels is very significant because it has the Nikud and support for Jehovah. The Hebrew version of Matthew and Luke actually contain information in there that helps us actually to learn the dates that they were written, and that is very significant and important, and I will show that. The Hebrew version of Matthew and Luke contain vowel points. These vowel points in Hebrew are called nikud, and in English it just mainly means punctuation. If you have a look at the oldest and most ancient Hebrew manuscripts we have today, for example Dead Sea Scrolls, you will not see the nikud, and you never see the name Jehovah. However, if you grab a newer and more modern Hebrew manuscript, you will notice under the Hebrew characters like dots and lines, for example, you might see a couple of dots and 3 dots and so on. And each of those have a name like Sigal and Patak and so on. And it makes a little bit easier for people to read Hebrew. And especially for newer people, because they'll notice these characters like the lines and dots, and they just help the new people in Hebrew to pronounce words a little bit easier. But you will find that most Israelites don't use the nikud, because they are mainly used for beginners in Hebrew. So nikud could actually be looked at sort of like training wheels for somebody that's learning how to read Hebrew. So therefore you'll see that a lot of people educated in Hebrew, they don't need nikud at all. So this is basically what nikud means. So not only does nikud help beginners in Hebrew to read it, but it also helps us to put a date on the manuscripts, and that is so important and vital right now in the context of this presentation that I'm sharing with you. So may I say, also on the topic of this, I'm actually against nikud. I prefer the older manuscripts like we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc., because I believe it, just in my personal opinion, I believe it's forbidden to add anything to Scripture, as it changes words, names, meaning, the way we pronounce things that was not directly taught by the Creator. And if you watch my other videos on Yahweh and Jehovah, you will notice that as a result of these artificially added point system, it's changing the whole Scripture, the way the names and words are pronounced and the meaning of it. And that, in my opinion, is absolutely forbidden to add or remove from Scripture. If we found the original Hebrew manuscripts, they would not have the nikud. So far as to say, the nikud actually helps us to identify the dating, as I've mentioned. So that's very important, because that way we can actually identify the dates when these were written, and we can clearly see that there is no chance whatsoever that Luke or Matthew were authors of these manuscripts. We can tell by the nikud that these manuscripts were written hundreds of years after the death of Matthew and Luke, and that they would not have appeared in the originals and do not reflect or mirror the original manuscripts. Something important to know is that the nikud was not invented until after the 6th century, which means it didn't appear in the public realm till after 400 years after Matthew and Luke died. And there is a difference between the nikud systems, which I just want to cover on just very briefly, and I encourage you to do your own due diligence and look into this a little bit more for yourself. But it's crucial to date the different nikud systems, as this is very important, because as I'll be showing now, it gives us a very clear indication and understanding when these particular new, quote-unquote, Hebrew New Testament manuscripts that have apparently been discovered, so that we can accurately date them to know that they are nothing like the originals would have been, and they have not been written by the original authors of the Gospels, and that they only contain the name Jehovah based on the 6th century and onwards artificially added vowel pointing that creates the new made-up name of Jehovah. So let's begin with the first known Nukud system, which is the Babylonian Nukud system. And it was introduced by the Babylonian Jews during the early medieval era. Now remember that, because that is very important. Because that means it was never before the year 500, so nowhere near the 3rd century or the 2nd century or the 1st century. It was nowhere near the dates where Matthew and Luke were alive writing the Gospels. The main feature of the Babylonian Jews was to have the Nukud above the letters, and that is significant, and I want you to remember that. And the one used today is the later Nukud, the Tiberian Nukud system, which has other unique markings like curvature, short squiggly lines. You'll notice if you have a look at them. You'll notice someone reading the later Nukud system that they harmonize and they chant in a way as they are reading as a result of the Tiberian Nukud. So it has a different purpose. But also keeping it back in your mind too, these were artificially inserted by man, not the Creator. Not inspired by the Creator. This is a man's invention, and that's why we get made up the name Jehovah. And it's important to understand all this, because that helps us to understand where and how the name Jehovah was created and invented and artificially made up, and how it was never in existence before the 6th century when the different Nukud systems were invented. So the other Nukud system around the same time is the Eretz Israel Nukud system, which also places the Nukud above the letters like the Babylonian counterparts. But it was slightly different in how they applied the Nukud above the letters. But those two, they have the Nukud above the letters. Then the other Nukud system is the Tiberius Nukud system, which is what we see mostly today. And the difference with this one is that the Nukud is placed under the letters. So the other ones were placed above, and the Tiberius Nukud system is placed under the letters. There is an exception, however, the Aleppo Codex, which seems to use both forms, and as a result the name Jehovah was created that does not appear without the Nukud, which the Masoretes invented with the vowel signs, which are placed above, below, or sometimes within the letters, I believe. And these were invented and created and artificially inserted centuries, and I do repeat this, centuries after the New Testament Gospel writers had passed away. So these manuscripts cannot be relied upon, and they contain zero evidence, proof or support for the name Jehovah, as Jehovah is not the original true name. Actually, please watch my video titled Biblical and Hebrew Scholar Shows Why Jehovah and Jehovah Are Wrong, where a Hebrew scholar explains how Jehovah was invented and made up and is not the original name, and why it never appears in the earliest manuscripts we have today. The Jehovah name comes mainly from the Masoretic family. Apparently, according to history, they were a group of Karaite Jews, but apparently they renounced their Karaitism, so the current editions that is mainly used today is basically from the Masoretic system. And there is another scribal codex called the Aleppo, which I touched on, and that is found from the city of Aleppo in Syria, which is also used by the Jehovah followers today. However, as we can see clearly, is that the current Hebrew manuscripts used today in the Aleppo Codex, for example, they all contain the added pointing and markings, which then have created this new erroneous name Jehovah. And I reiterate, the name Jehovah never exists in the earliest manuscripts that we have. And the Nukud and Jehovah doesn't even exist in the Mishnah, And the Mishnah was actually published at the end of the 2nd century, hundreds of years before Jehovah name was made up. And the Mishnah is actually the first major written collection of the Jewish oral traditions, known as the quote-unquote oral Torah. It is also the first major work of rabbinical literature. And as stated, even they do not contain the vowel points needed for Jehovah. And remember, Nikud is like the training wheels. It's only for beginners new to Hebrew reading. And that's why most Israelites don't need a Nikud. And hence, they do not believe in Jehovah, because they never read that in the Hebrew manuscripts. Unless, of course, they pick up a copy of the Leper Codex, for example, with the added vowel points. Now, even I, as a Yahweh believer, I will read Jehovah in these later manuscripts with the Nikud and the added vowel points, because that's what it says. When you have that name made up with a combination of Adonai and the Tetragrammaton, that's what it come up with. And as we see today, many who have a master's degree from Hebrew University, they have a PhD, they are the top credible Hebrew professors and scholars in the world today from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Tolv and Professor Fazberg, for example, who says Jehovah is nonsensical and is a mistake. And remember, these have master's degrees from Hebrew University. They are the top super Hebrew professors and scholars in the world today, and they're saying Jehovah is not the accurate name. And the reason they're saying that is because they understand that YHWH is ancient, and that YHVH and Jehovah is modern invention. And it was only an invention from the 6th century and later, after the invention of the Nikud. David Biven, for example, says it really well. He is a well-known and very credible scholar. I've even heard other Jewish scholars uplift David Biven and saying that David is a great pioneer of biblical scholarship. And David says, quote unquote, at the time the Hebrew Bible was being composed, the Va, V-A-V, the third letter of the Tetragrammaton, was pronounced as a W rather than a V as in modern Hebrew. Now, all the top scholars today, from having the master's degree from Hebrew universities to the professors and scholars from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, they all have an awareness and an understanding that V is a modern Hebrew. That's why Jehovah with the V, that's modern. It's not ancient. That's why they all know that Jehovah is not the accurate ancient name, because it's a new modern Hebrew. For further information about that too, please watch my video titled David Biven, Biblical Scholar. Jehovah is a sign of misunderstanding of the Masoretic text. And in my video there, I've got a couple of links to David's articles, so please have a read of those. So in conclusion, through the Nikud system, we can clearly and accurately see that YHVH and Jehovah are new modern inventions, and they do not appear in the 1st century or before. They only appear hundreds and hundreds of years after the gospel writers had passed away. So any claims that these Hebrew New Testament versions of the Gospels, of Matthew and Luke, for example, and then John, and whatever else comes up, you can now know that that is a result of the Nikud system. And now you have an awareness about the invention of the Nikud system. And the Nikud system never appears in the earliest manuscripts. And that's something important to remember. And it would not appear in the originals. This is new inventions, and therefore you cannot get the name Jehovah unless you have the Nikud. And that's been added by man, not by the Father. and we should not add anything to the righteous scriptures. Leave them alone. Leave the scriptures alone and do not add to them. Hopefully that's been helpful, and may Yahweh bless your journey into all truth. Shalom.